on this issue, I do think there's so many questions raised about Portland. I want to add my voice to Senator Wyden. I would like you to work, obviously you got to see this, you got to go through your appropriate channels once you get confirmed. But I hope as much as possible can be released as well. And I think we should frankly give members extra credit for actually being here in person, but that's not the rules. So we'll now go to Senator Cotton on WebEx.
Mr. Chairman, we appreciate the extra credit.
Well, and if Tom doesn't poke his head up soon, I'm going to go to you. Senator Cotton, are you out there in Etherland? Mr. Vice Chairman, I'm going to make an executive ruling and go to Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wainstein, congratulations on your nomination, and thank you for your lengthy, distinguished public service. And I'm glad your family could be here. I'm sure they're very proud of you, and I'm sure your service is a family affair, and not just you're not just out hanging out there on your own. Senator Rubio talked about the work you did for Chinese clients, and I don't imagine you had to register. I don't think you had to register under Foreign Agents Registration Act, did you?
No, and I've never lobbied.
Have you had some experience with the Foreign Agents Registration Act during your service?
When I was in government, yes. Enforcement of that was under me, or under our division.
I think we've seen a number of instances that certainly have been disturbing to me, where foreign governments have hired lobbyists here in Washington, D.C., who have not registered under the Foreign Agent Registration Act, but rather under the Lobbyist Disclosure Act, in order to obscure their representation of foreign governments. But we're here because we were elected by our constituents to serve the people of this country and not foreign countries, and certainly not without our knowledge of who is advocating for policy changes in Congress. Could you expand upon your views of the role of the Foreign Agent Registration Act and whether you believe that it is adequately serving its purpose?
Thank you, Senator. Look, I think you're putting your finger on a very critical issue. FAIR has been around for a long time, but it hasn't been enforced with sufficient energy for decades, for as long as it's been around. There has been a focus on FARA over the last few years. I know that the Justice Department has added resources to that, National Security Division, and they're focusing on bringing cases. And I think they need to, because I think you're right. We need to know whom people are speaking for when they're advocating for legislative change and the like. So I agree with that, and to the extent that I'll have any role in that at INA, it would be minimal, but to the extent I would do everything I can to encourage strong enforcement.
Well, there have been bipartisan bills knocking around here for a while now, and we haven't been able to get those passed yet, but I would hope you would use the benefit of your experience and your perspective to advocate within the administration for those changes so we can know it. There's even been when we were considering the Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act to allow the 9/11 families an opportunity to file litigation over foreign financing of the terrorist attack on 9/11. One foreign government went so far as not just to hire U.S. lobbyists here in Washington, D.C., but also to enlist the aid of veterans who came up here without disclosing who was paying for their hotel room and who was financing their presence here, and purported to be advocating on behalf of United States military veterans. So this takes a lot of different shapes and forms, but I think it's an insidious problem, and one that I hope you will help us in whatever way you can to address. I want to ask you, there's been an increased focus on domestic terrorism, obviously since the events of a year ago on January the 6th. But what part of the U.S. government, in terms of law enforcement, particularly is when insofar as it affects the intelligence community, would have jurisdiction to investigate cases of so-called domestic terrorism?
Now, that's a good question, sir, and it sort of goes to the point that I talked about with the chairman about sort of the areas of overlap, and this is an area where there is shared jurisdiction, there's shared responsibilities to do intelligence and law enforcement work vis-a-vis the domestic terrorism threat. Obviously, the FBI takes point on domestic terrorism when it comes to doing investigations, building cases. And in fact, they will not do, and I think Jill Sanborn has testified to this, in fact, that they will not do intelligence work absent some predicate. You know, there has to be some predication under the FBI guidelines for them to do that. INA approaches it from a different vantage point. It doesn't have that predicate responsibility. It has limitations I discussed earlier, that it has to be pursuant to a departmental mission. It can't be focused on First Amendment rights, et cetera. But they can do the open source searching or collection if it relates to a threat that DHS is statutorily tasked with protecting against. And so it's a complementary assignment of responsibility between the FBI and DHS and INA. And then the additional piece is that INA plays a critical role in tying the federal government's responsibilities and efforts against domestic terrorism with the state, local, tribal, territorial, and private sector. And that's a really important piece and real huge value add that INA brings to the domestic terrorism fight and, frankly, to the whole intelligence enterprise.
Mr. Chairman, I have a few more questions. I'll wait for a second round if
Yes,
that's
sir.
your preference.
I think that's probably Senator Heinrich's preference as well. Senator Heinrich.
I'll try to be brief. Mr. Wainstein, when the American public